He ran the city like a rumor you couldn't walk away from, the kind that altered people's posture the moment his name was spoken. Rocco Moretti carried that rumor in tailor-made suits, and a silence that filled rooms. The Obsidian belonged to him. A surplus of velvet and lowlight where power looked like an accessory. Men came to prove themselves. Women learned how to survive the angle of his gaze. Drinks were served in crystal that caught the smile of someone counting their options. Nobody ever spilled anything on purpose. Stella walked into that room carrying a tray and an intentional unravel. Her dress was carefully untidy, sleeves a little too long, hair pulled into a loose knot that suggested tiredness rather than fashion. She kept her shoulders small and her back a straight line that obeyed the rules of staying unseen. Behind the apron and under the frayed sweater there was a spine someone had gifted her in a former life. Tonight, she wrapped it in linen and practiced the expression of someone who could be ignored. The Obsidian had a temperature to it. It smelled of cognac and pressed leather, of old money and newer debts. Rocco sat in his corner like a lord of some subterranean court, the light cutting across his cheekbones like a verdict. People orbiting him told each other stories about how he handled trouble. The stories made him sound like a machine that only ever worked one way, to crush, rearrange, and profit. Stella's tray slid. It was a gesture that might have been clumsy or might have been fate. A glass tipped. Wine arced in slow color and landed, a red comet, across the front of Rocco's jacket and onto the marble table between him and the men closest to him. A hush dropped like a lid. Rocco's eyes did not widen. They narrowed. The laugh that came from his table was a dry thing, offered to the room like an example. The men who laughed felt safer in their laughter than in the silence that followed. "Watch it," said one of them, a voice that wanted authority and landed somewhere between a warning and a dare. Stella's hand hovered, then steadied, and she reached for napkins the way someone might reach for a fact. People were watching. She was small enough for their attention to pass through and large enough when they touched her to be a mistake. Rocco's smile was slow. "You spill for a living." He spoke with the boredom of someone who had effortless cruelty to give away. His tone made the corner feel sharper, as if they'd all been gathered to see her made small.
"Sorry," Stella said.
The word was automatic, a reflex learned long ago. Her voice was flat, carefully nothing. A good waitress knows which apologies are performance and which are liability. She offered the performance. Victor leaned forward like an audience member in a cheap theater, his mouth already plotting a joke that would be taken by Rocco as approval. There are men who cannot resist nudging a woman down to paper size if the boss gives the green light. Victor was one of them. "Shit like that," Victor said. The way he said it stretched her into a role he wanted to knit her into. Punchline, footrest, "You make a mess like that, you pay." Rocco lifted a glass to his lips and let the fingers of his opposite hand rest on the arm of the chair. He was slow and deliberate, cruelty arranged as leisure. "No," he said then, and his eyes cut the room like a blade. "Make her work it off." "Work it off," someone barked, amusement mixing with curiosity. The club had a basement ring, a concrete pit where men and the occasional woman went to show they hurt less than the other guy. It was entertainment, arbitration, and punishment all at once. The room hummed. For Rocco, the basement was a tool as useful as a ledger. For Victor, it was a theater. For Stella, it was an assignment she did not accept in the way the room meant it. She did not shrink and bend and apologize until she was small enough to be stepped on. But tonight, she had no way of refusing. The rules of the Obsidian did not allow dissent from the head table. "Basement," Rocco said. His voice made the word into an order the room prized as a jewel. "Let her show us how she cleans." Someone from the staff stepped, whispering. A rope of men parted, and the club's stare swallowed Stella in its carpeted maw. The air there had less perfume and more sweat. The light lost volume. The walls closed. Down below, the ring waited, like a promise. It was concrete cinder block and a single bare bulb that hung low and unforgiving. Men had traded rib shots there. Heads had been split. It smelled like old bruises and iron. Stella looked small in the flat light, a waitress among a sea of men who had come to make a point with their fists. Rocco's men pushed her into the center. Victor joked, Luca, Rocco's bodyguard, watched more quietly. Luca's hands were too big for his face, and his stare measured things the way a mechanic measures metal. For weakness, for bend. He had been Rocco's shadow for years. Friendly, faithful, efficient. He had learned to translate Rocco into action. "Don't hurt her," Rocco said. The words landed oddly. He had not meant them to be tender. He meant them as a coiled curiosity, the kind of hold you give to a creature you are testing for something valuable. "Make it interesting," Victor said. "Grin like a coin. Make it quick." Stella's knees were steady beneath the thin dress. Her hands were not away from her body the way a frightened woman's often are. They were loose. Fingers opened in that easy way fighters keep them when they are ready to close. She had been trained in places that smelled of chalk and corded ropes, in gyms that made a soft religion of repetition. She had learned how to time breath and bone, how to make a body become a tool under pressure. None of that was visible now. Her shirt was dusted with spilled wine. The apron had absorbed the shape of her life like a second skin. She nodded to the man they pushed forward against her, a petty scraper named Marco, who had the guilty look of someone who had volunteered for too many bets. He had the kind of confidence that dissolves quickly against a person who is not who they pretend to be. He launched himself at her with the sloppy enthusiasm of someone who'd seen only one film about fights and expected a boxer to meet him with a showy and a swing that was loud. Stella moved like a whisper. She took the ring as if passing through a room, cataloging angles, habits, the way a man breathes when he is about to swing wide. She let him hit her shoulder once, taking weight into the ground the way roots take water. It registered a pressure, and then she turned it into momentum. A slip, a heel pivot. The action was tiny, precise, the kind of thing only a trained body does. Not to be impressive, but to be efficient. When she folded him back into the ropes, the room cheered and jeered and did not yet understand. Marco's face was red, the shape of his mouth a surprise. He felt a pain he could not name. Rocco leaned forward, and there was the first, small shift. His attention was a magnet now for each motion Stella made. "You got a name?" Marco spat, disbelieving. "Stella," she answered. The name hung, harmless. They wanted showmanship. She gave them nothing. She gave the necessary work and held her expression flat, a mask that read as apologetic. It was a performance that looked like submission. It was not. "Another," Victor demanded. Men became louder when they needed to cover a bruise in their dignity. He chose a different man, heavier, with hands like blocks. The men wanted to see how much he would take. Rocco watched, as if the motions of a chessboard were unfolding in front of him. There had been rumors about women like her, ghosts, with gloves, women who had walked away from their own wrecks and made themselves invisible. Rocco had never been bored enough to care. Now boredom turned to attention. A careful predator senses a shift when his prey's heart rate changes and either tenses to strike or studies it to learn. The heavy man came in hard, trying to take her with force. He underestimated timing. Stella read the tension in his shoulders like a note in a chord and answered by turning his strength into a vector against his own center. She did not let herself rage. She reserved the violence she had for a specific result. When his flank opened, she sent a blow into space that was neither theatrical nor cruel. It was surgical. A liver shot, delivered by the arc of her hip and the snap of her fist. He collapsed with a sound like the room itself, inhaling. Silence shocked the basement. Rocco's mouth was thin stripe of attention. The men didn't laugh any longer. Victor's smile frayed. Stella stood in the harsh light, apron stained, breath measured, the way of someone used to doing hard things and keeping count. For a moment, the room did not speak. The audience waited, because the basement demanded satisfaction, and satisfaction usually came with sound. It didn't come now. There was only the small twitch at the edge of Rocco's mouth, interest, not yet warmth. "You didn't look like much," Rocco said, the statement more factual than cruel. It sounded like a man admitting a mistake he wanted to explore, not fix. Stella inclined her head. "I finished my shift." "That's your line?" Victor laughed, too loud. "That's my line," she said. The words were simple. They were not a plea. The men dispersed. some left with a new whisper in their mouths. Rocco rose, smoothing his jacket. For the first time since the wine, he looked past the stain to the person beneath it, and he did not like what he saw, or perhaps he did, in the way of a man who recognizes a new instrument he could use. He walked toward the back stairs, and Stella followed only because she had to, not because she wanted to, not yet. Because exits are like doors in a maze, and sometimes you must step through to know why you entered. The stairwell smelled like bleach and old decisions. Luca stayed a pace behind Rocco, the kind of guard who exists to be necessary but not seen. Victor trailed, all swagger and friction. They reached Rocco's table. He looked at Stella and the way a man inspects a coin he does not yet intend to spend. "You impressed me," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a ledger entry. "Good," Stella replied. Her voice did not ask for anything. She had learned, somewhere between hard gyms and harder nights, that acknowledgement is currency. She kept her hands empty of need. Rocco paused. The corner he inhabited sharpened. He wanted to test, to see the limits of that competence. He wanted to see whether she could be useful or dangerous. And to whom? He had always preferred to understand his variables before making a move. "Sit with us after your shift," he said. It was a phrase dressed as a courtesy and sewn with a threat. "We like to talk to the help." Stella could have refused. She didn't. She nodded the way someone nods when all other choices have been counted. There is a difference between consent given of free will and consent given because the alternatives are worse. Stella measured both and chose the option that kept her alive and in motion. The rest of her shift passed in the kind of mechanical grace that is practiced like a prayer. She moved among tables, laughed in the right places, took orders, avoided elbows. When the club emptied and the high voices thinned into the scrape of chairs, Rocco's men escorted her to the private room reserved for his amusements. The air there was heavier still, like a vault. Rocco watched her as if he were cataloguing possible uses. "Downstairs," he said again, and there was a precision to his voice now. For real this time. The basement ring had rules. People were put in the ring to settle debts, to entertain, to punish. There were men who had been asked to leave the city rather than face the shame that followed a loss before the Moretti table. For them, the basement was retribution. For Stella, it was visibility. She understood both. She went down because the floor beneath her was the only surface that allowed her to move without being someone else's problem. She stepped into the concrete light and the men pressed around the ropes. Marco's face was purple where it had been indented. Victor had a new edge to his mouth, and Luca kept his arms folded like a hinge. "On your feet," someone called. It was a version of courtesy in the basement, a signal that the spectacle would begin. Her opponent was not a volunteer this time. He was a man assigned by Victor, a hollow-looking grinder named Sal, who liked to swing and count. Sal moved with the lazy faith of a man who'd been taught that strength is the same as victory. He came like a truck, with intention but no art. Stella watched the same things she'd watched before. Weight distribution, blink patterns, the fraction of a second when a man's mouth goes slack before his hand tells the rest of his body what to do. She kept her face blank. The first exchanges were cheap. Sal's fists thudded, and Stella took them. She allowed one to connect to the shoulder, a contact that would satisfy the crowd. Pain is useful when you know its price. She spent the early minutes storing moments like groats. Let him tire. Let him think he is wearing you down. Her training told her to preserve energy, to place strikes only where they would change the argument. She used small motions to worry at the angles of his attack until the openings were like a map to follow. When she sent the liver shot, not with fury, but with mathematic calm, Sal folded like a tent, collapsing under wind. The cry he made was not loud, it was resigned. The men around the ring made the noise of people who had found surprising things, a till where there had been coal. Rocco did not move. His fingers twitched once against his glass. For the first time, interest had teeth. He wanted to know why she had left whatever life she had behind and walked into the Obsidian's light like a moth to a dangerous flame. He also wanted to know whether it was possible to use someone like her without breaking them. A question that had gotten a lot of bosses killed. Back above, the club's regular electricity hummed. People returned to their seats with stories to refold and carry. Rocco's eyes were still on Stella. He had never been a man to be surprised at his own mistakes. He catalogued them instead, saving them for later dividends. "You could have made more of a show," Victor said, anger and admiration braided together in his tone. "Why so?" "Clean? Because I don't work for an audience," Stella replied. Her voice had a coldness that was not malice. It was a boundary. Rocco's answer came slow. "You don't have to." "Not yet." He watched her, learning the way you learn a tools. "Wait. Kamushito." It was the offer of shelter, disguised as command. Stella could have walked. She did not. She sat across from him at the table, napkin still clutched in her hands like a small flag. Her eyes met his only briefly. It was better to take things in pieces. His question was not a question. "Where did you train?" "Where people teach necessity," she said. The words were flat. She gave nothing else. "You're not supposed to be here," Rocco said. There was a compliment in the statement only a man like him would understand, the kind that acknowledged something sharp standing out of place. "I'm where I need to be," Stella answered. It was true in 1,000 small ways. She had chosen the Obsidian for its anonymity and its danger, because both suited the calculus she'd been living by. She had been running for a long time. She had learned to hide in plain sight. Rocco studied her and then laughed. A sound that did not mean mirth. "So," he said slowly, "you fight like someone who doesn't want an audience? You dress like someone who wants to be invisible? Why hide that kind of thing?" Stella looked down at her stained apron. "Because sometimes being invisible keeps you alive." Her answer was a simple arithmetic. Rocco's expression shifted. He had never been a man comfortable with arithmetic that reduced his options. He liked variables he could control. She was a variable that would not yield easily to his old ways. "Do you want money?" Victor asked, the practical greed of his class showing. "We can pay you. Little job here, little job there." "No," Stella said. She knew how to earn money without having it given. She had spent years surviving on the edge of necessity, but she also knew when an offer was more than money, when it was leverage. She kept that knowledge private. Rocco leaned forward and regarded her as if measuring iron. "I can offer protection. I can give you work where you don't have to hide in the corners." Protection in his mouth tasted like a contract. Everything he offered was wrapped in debt. Stella recognized the language. She also recognized another language beneath it. The hint of opportunity. "Why would I trust that?" she asked. She did not sound incredulous. She sounded like a negotiator. Trust was not a sentiment she hoarded. It was a currency with heavy interest. "Because you just saved a life here," Rocco said. "Including mine. And people will come for both of us. Think of it as an exchange." The club around them resumed its low noise, but Stella felt something tightened in the air, like the closing of a trap. The name the gallows had been mentioned in streets and bars as an answer to some debts. Men who did not care for delicacy. She knew their reputation. Rocco knew who made a city tremble. If the offer was a hand with hooks, it was also the only hand within reach. "One night," she said, "one night, and then I decide." Rocco flicked a glance at Luca, who nodded once, like a hinge agreeing to close. The deal had the faint smell of a promise, and promises with his name attached carried weight. He could keep people, and he could break them. He had owned that latter talent long enough to know not to brag. "One night," he agreed. "See how useful you are?" There was a click at the edge of the private room, a small sound like a lock taking interest. Stella felt the thinnest vibration of something passing her like a draft. She sat back in her chair and thought of every quiet room she'd slept in, the safe houses, and the gym floors, and places where people breathed in turns. She thought of how being noticed split the map of a life into new lines. Outside, down the hollow of the street, the city moved in a rhythm that was merciless. The Obsidian had the kind of light that preserved its versions of the world. Stella had come into it deliberately, and now the room's eye was on her. A bar patron, at a neighboring table, made a toast. Rocco raised his glass like a benediction. Stella touched the rim of her napkin, and let it hang. If you love a story where the one who seems insignificant ends up reshuffling the deck, stick around for this. They walked her to the door. Rocco watched her leave. The stain on his jacket was an open ledger now, a thing that could be read, interpreted, and exploited. He did not like being surprised, but he liked knowing how to turn surprises into assets. As the night's details folded into memory, he catalogued that she had been meant to be small and had instead demonstrated the kind of capacity that commands attention. Outside the club, a black car waited. It had the muffled presence of men used to secrecy. Luca opened the door for Rocco with a practiced motion. Victor lingered, wanting the last word. Stella turned away from their faces into the city's night, and she did not feel like a victim. She felt like someone watching her life come up against the measure of what she was willing to risk. She was heading back to the hostel she used when she needed anonymity. Upstairs, the lights were cheap and the locks were older than the people who liked to test them. She had a towel for the wine, a pocket with change, a pair of gloves in the bottom of the apron. She had a history she did not speak of, and a list of people whose names she had carved into memory. When her phone vibrated, it was a thin, routine sting. A message from Eddie, the gym owner who kept a place for those who needed to stay anonymous and strong. "You okay?" It read. Eddie's message was pure, simple. Eddie had a face like a prayer and hands that remembered how to sew up a score. Stella typed back one word. "Okay." She slept with lights half on and dreams the color of sparring. She woke hours later to the city's pale announcement of dawn and the memory of a ring under a bulb and the taste of iron somewhere at the back of her mouth. She thought of the man who'd laughed at her and the other who had fallen. She thought of debt and how it could be traded. By the time she returned to the Obsidian for the follow-up Rocco requested, the gossip had already settled into shapes. A waitress surprising the table. A man with a jacket now dotted in rumor. People loved to have the world be the same as yesterday. They hated when someone like her reminded them that outcomes could bend. Rocco was waiting in his corner, the way a king waits for a courtier to prove a point. He sauntered over when she approached, the movement of a man accustomed to owning floor space. His eyes were quieter. He offered her a seat. "You've been around?" he said. "You move with the calculation of someone who has been watched and has decided it was wise to stop running in obvious directions." Stella met him. "I move in ways that keep me alive." "Alive and useful," he corrected. The correction was not a project of charity. It was inventory. He liked to know what could be leveraged. "What's your price?" she asked. She had learned to ask directly. It saved trouble. "Not money," he said. "Protection? Access, information, places you shouldn't be able to find, people you shouldn't be invited to meet. We can make enemies disappear and build new alliances. You could be safe and useful." "Safe with you?" Stella's laugh was a small thing, brittle. "Read the room, boss." "It comes with terms," Rocco said. "I do not do charity. We trade. You help me keep the club in order. I keep you from others." There was a weight to his words, and an unspoken understanding sat in the space between them. The gallows, the line of men who liked to settle scores with teeth and steel. If they were on a collision course with him, taking in a woman who could fight was a strategic acquisition. If he was looking at her as an instrument, she saw that too. Instruments can be used, instruments can be dangerous. "One night," Stella said again, "I test you, you test me. Then we make a decision." Rocco's smile was a narrow thing. "Put it like that, and I can agree." He raised his glass, not in toast, but in actual calculation. Stella lifted her napkin because manners made you appear smaller than you were, and sometimes appearing smaller was tactical. They did not know, then, that the city outside the Obsidian had already started to notice them in a different way. There are always eyes that register a rearrangement of power. There are ears that track the movement of a boss who accepts a new ally. Somewhere, in the dry spaces of the city, a ledger had been opened. The name Don Carlo Gallo lived in that ledger, like a blot. Don Carlo preferred to keep his hands clean by hiring others. He kept lists of people who interfered with his plans. Rocco inhaled the club's atmosphere and felt a faint prickle at the back of his neck. It was not a warning so much as a notification. Something else was moving in the dark. He had made a new decision. And decisions attract consequences with the same inevitability as gravity. Stella left his table and returned to work. The layers of waitress and fighter sliding over each other like well-oiled sections. Her hands were steady. She was a woman who had taken risks the way other people took breaths. She did not romanticize what she did. She counted stakes. Outside, the first night of the agreement lived in a small, precise anecdote that would travel over the city like a rumor. Rocco had underestimated a waitress and miscalculated his math. Nobody could tell, at that time, if he had made the mistake that would undo him, or if he had simply found an asset he could shape to his liking. Neither of them knew yet how quickly the discovery would force both of them to scramble. They only knew that the room had changed, and that in places like theirs, change demands action. When the doors closed behind the Obsidian that night and the staff began to lock up, Stella tucked her apron into her bag and looked at the back of the club once more. A man like Rocco offered you safety the way some men offered you a handshake. It both bound you and left a bruise. She went home to the small room she rented, to the towel, the phone, the soup she ate straight from a tin. She sat on the bed and massaged her knuckles until the throbbing was just a memory. She thought of choices. She thought of how often she had been measured and found to be light. She thought of how often that had saved her life. The next morning, a name lit on her phone that she tried to ignore. Victor. The message preview was a line of laughter and a photograph, a prank, a brag, a need for witnessing. She put the phone face down and washed her hands under cold water until the skin pruned. People like Victor had a way of broadcasting events as if sunlight. Victor had not yet understood the shape of what he'd unleashed. There are nights when one small act sends a city into a series of calculations that end in violence, in alliances, in betrayals. Stella had not wanted to be at the center of something like that, but being invisible had a price. And sometimes the price was the kind of attention that makes you useful to the right kind of monster. She smoked for a minute on the fire escape and watched the city wake. She measured the sun's reach across roofs and wondered how long she would be allowed to make herself small inside the outline of the Obsidian. She had a list in her head of people she'd met and people she didn't trust. It was not long. It was direct. Behind her, the stair door banged. Men moved through the alleys and cars took shape like black fish. Names were being whispered in places that smelled of grease and coffee. The gallows were nothing if not efficient rumor amplifiers. At noon, the day after the wine, Rocco called. His voice was the room carved into sound. "We move tonight," he said. "I want you with me." Stella thought of the tape of the basement, of the way the light had sat on faces when she had taken weight into her hip and turned it into a sentence. She thought of the ledger and of the muscular boredom of men who liked to buy loyalty. "Why?" she asked. "Because I want to see what happens when someone like you stands with someone like me," he said. There was a challenge in the invitation that was not purely professional. It tasted of the same thing that had led men into bad bets for centuries. Curiosity. He wanted to know whether he could rewrite the rules around who defended whom. Stella did not answer immediately. She had made a bargain of one night, not an offer to be bound. "I'll be there," she said finally. It was an answer that kept doors open. That night, the Obsidian hummed with the same lethargic gold. Rocco wore his jacket. Luca was at his shoulder. Victor hovered like a bad smell. The club's rhythm seemed the same, but things were altered, like a pattern in wallpaper slightly off. If you looked long enough, your eye registered that the repeat was not exact. They moved through the room and into a back corridor that led to a private table. The space beyond smelled like old money and adrenaline. Rocco's hand brushed the back of her shoulder the way a man checks his property. It could have been ownership, but it was also a shield, a small talisman against the possibility of something else. Stella did not flinch. They had no idea the gallows had been watching for months. The gallows preferred to do things that left others to arrange the narrative. Big, loud mistakes that created fear and confusion. They were not subtle. They needed an opening, an assumption to exploit. Rocco's public attention to a fighter like Stella was the kind of flash they could use for leverage. The first sign of the breach was a power hiccup, the kind that nudges a room into anxiety. Lights dimmed, conversations cut off. For a second, everyone thought it was the city's grid, an inconvenience. Then the blackness swallowed the obsidian like a mouth closing. The security cameras blinked, and then went dead. Rocco's table did not move at first. Men cursed and groped for the edge of the world they trusted. The sound of the blackout made oxygen heavier. Then, through the blackout, something else arrived. A rifle's throat. It was precise and terrifying. The voice of people who had planned for dark entrances. The gallows had timed something to the city's pulse. Someone screamed. The sound damaged the room's skin. Men pushed. The front doors of the club were locked. Not by policy, but by the sense that, in a blackout, exits can become traps. Rocco's men reacted like muscle memory. Luca reached for the small of his back, where his holster rested, and the world narrowed into urgent motion. Stella's instincts were a library opened in a foreign language. In the dark, she moved like someone who had read the book before. Her hands found the latch on the service door. She could smell gun oil, an animal scent of powder and fear. She did not wait to ask why. She moved into action. She found Rocco a heartbeat after the first shots. Luca was giving orders through his teeth, short, distorted commands that were meant to make men into tools. Victor had vanished into the crowd like a flea. Rocco was not above blood, but he was not, in that instant, bleeding. He stood like a block of granite surrounded by panic. "Get them into the service routes," Luca barked. "We move fast. We lock down." "Too loud," Rocco said. "Not now." He looked at Stella. He saw the way she moved, the way her jaw closed. There was no surprise in his face now. There was something like calculation. "You," he told her. "With us." Stella's answer was a plan executed in moments. She pushed a bar cart into the doorway, turning it into a shield, the way a man might use a crate. She grabbed a wrench from beneath a sink and felt its weight. She moved with the clarity of someone who understood how to use improvised objects without thought. She slipped past a man who was about to fall and used his momentum to redirect an attacker into the concrete steps, where the club's service halted its breath. The gallows were trained and they were precise. They moved with the awful economy of a crew that had rehearsed this scenario. Their faces were covered or indifferent. Their weapons were not brandished for theatrics. They were there to take. Their leader's voice, cavernous and organized, barked orders and treated everyone like a number to be cleared. Stella felt the compartments of her memory opened, technique, timing, the quick mathematics of angles. She did not think of the past the way some people think of trauma. She thought of it the way a doctor thinks of a surgery, as a necessary arrangement of actions to produce outcomes. She took hits that needed to be taken. She delivered precisely measured violence that unmade the motions of the gallows assault. Rocco moved as well. He was a man used to ordering others to act. In close quarters, he had to rely on Luca and the bodies around him. He adapted. He became more than a boss. He became someone whose survival required him to be present. The hiss of emergency lights and the crash of someone hitting the floor became the club's new soundtrack. For every move the gallows made that was elegant and lethal, Stella found a counter that was impurity made useful. A wine bottle used to distract, a chain used to trip a boot, a hand on a throat turned into a springboard. She was not a machine. She made choices, and each choice had an ethics that she owned. A man who would otherwise have died for profit found himself draped across a table, breathing and grateful and surprised. In seconds that felt like an epoch, the room's center of gravity shifted. The gallows had not expected a waitress to be the variable that broke their plan. The sight of her apron stained, hair loose, fists curled with a history they did not have, reframed the attack into a different question. The intruders had not accounted for a person who could see the joints in their motions. A shooter fell after a single, precise strike that came from a direction nobody expected. A mercenary who tried to plant an explosive device was unbalanced by a foot that had the wrong cadence. Men who had trained for overt power found themselves handled like tools by a person who did not need to prove anything. Stella's movements were a language the gallows had not learned. In the chaos, Rocco watched. The calculation in his eyes cleaved open into something that might have been admiration. He had a new datum. This waitress, whom he'd intended to humiliate, had saved his life and the lives of several of his men. That fact complicated his ledger. When the gunfire stuttered and the last attacker found himself dragged from beneath a bar cart, the gallows operation shattered into a scatter of bodies and retreat. They had not wanted a fight that required them to expose their numbers or their sponsors. They had chosen precision and gotten improvisation in return. And improvisation was a dangerous variable. Rocco stood in the wreck of his room and felt the brittle line between advantage and exposure slide under his feet. He had been outplayed by a person he had meant to humiliate. It was not a weakness he intended to feel. He intended to turn it into power. Stella, hands scraped and breathing hard, looked at the people around her. Men were patching wounds. Someone was murmuring a prayer they had not practiced before. Her eyes went to Luca, who stood with a limp where someone had hit him in the flank. He did not look dead. He looked like someone who had been scored by truth. Victor was nowhere to be seen. The absence of Victor carved a hollow that tasted of betrayal. Stella noticed that absence like a bruise. Rocco glanced at Luca, calculation and concern folding into something complicated. "You did well," he told Stella, and there was a thing in his voice that had nothing to do with patronage. The words were small and significant. He owed her. In his world, owing someone changed the balance of power in a way that demanded repayment. "You saved us," Luca said. He meant it in a way men sometimes mean things they cannot fully say out loud. He stepped forward, offering the kind of gratitude that took the shape of a hand on her forearm. Brief, an acknowledgement that carried weight without ceremony. Luca's eyes met hers for a second that held more than thanks, a tacit recognition of what she had done and of what it would cost them all. He turned away then, moving back into the business of the club, posture widening as if to fill a space that had shifted. Rocco stayed still longer. He watched the clean arc of her movement until the room's edges slid back into place. When he finally moved, his steps were measured, each one an inventory of consequence. He had been humiliated by the revelation of a capacity he had not accounted for. He had been saved by the very person he'd meant to belittle. The ledger in his head rebalanced itself with the force of that paradox. "House will be closed tomorrow," he said, the words delivering order and protection in the same breath. "Staff will be paid. Any witness who needs a quiet place will have it." It was not a pious offer. It was a management decision wrapped in a favor. Stella accepted neither charity nor threat. She accepted the fact that the night had altered the map and that remaining invisible no longer looked like the safest tactic. They moved fast after that. The gallows hit was enough to show where pressure points lay. Rocco tightened security, but tightening was only a short-term fix. He had people to mollify, enemies to readjust, and a table that now expected not only spectacle but also solutions. Being saved by a waitress complicated narratives of dominance. He also knew something else now. Stella was not merely useful. She could be decisive. "You'll need a place," he told her one evening, as the club hummed back toward its usual dangerous calm. "Somewhere off the grid. Somewhere that isn't on any list. Don't pick a place with your name on the mailbox," she said. It came out as a joke, but it was an instruction. She had lived long enough to know the difference between surfaces and the things that could scratch through them. Rocco chuckled, the sound small. "I have people," he said. "People who can find decent walls. People who can make things quiet. People who cost," she replied. She didn't say it to refuse. She said it to remind them both where bargains live. They negotiated in the way people who habitually trade favors negotiate. By offering and withholding. By letting the other know exactly what they wanted and what they feared. Stella asked for anonymity, cash, and access to Eddie's gym. Rocco asked for loyalty. For gestures that would put her with him when he needed strength he could not order into existence with a nod. Neither offered their entire selves. Both kept corners in reserve. Her safe house was a narrow studio in Queens that smelled faintly of soap and old coffee. It belonged to someone who rented it by the month and kept to themselves. The bed was a mattress on the floor. The blinds did not close properly. There was a lamp that hummed and a kettle that worked when it wanted to. It had the virtue of being small enough to be unremarkable and off the routes the gallows might check. Rocco's men left a duffel at her door. Cash, an extra phone that had been burned through a burner network, a bus pass, and a small, iron security lock that had nothing to do with style and everything to do with peace of mind. She unpacked the duffel carefully, as if unwrapping an argument she hadn't yet decided to accept. The cash slid into a sock. The phone went to the bottom drawer. She sat on the mattress and touched her knuckles, where they still ached. She breathed and counted the breaths, like a ritual. The city hummed outside the window. Far off, a siren threaded the morning. Days blurred into a new rhythm. Stella worked the Obsidian when she had to, kept quiet in Rocco's orbit, and spent small hours at Eddie's gym, where the air tasted like sweat and the rules were simple. Eddie was a man whose face had patience written into it. He patched fighters and held space for people who needed to be hard without becoming brittle. He refused to ask why she was there. Instead, he offered a bag of gloves, directions to a back room, and a nod that meant train more plainly than words could. Rocco visited when the mood of the club demanded him. He moved closer to Stella in ways that were guarded and curious, as if trying on the idea of a different equation. They did not become friends. They entered a practical proximity. Meals shared in hush rooms, strategic conversations that were short and full of implication. He paid off a debt of sorts, the debt of being saved by opening doors, and by asking small favors that almost always put them closer to each other. Victor watched from the edges, a mouth always ready to nibble on advantage. He had been the spark that flamed the initial insult. Now he watched with something flatter. Jealousy sharpened into resentment. He prowled, subtly, seeking an opening to reclaim the narrative he'd lost. For a man like Victor, being sidelined in the story of a boss's attention was an affront the world owed him remedy for. One night, Stella scanned the phone Rocco's men had given her and found a thread that made her skin go cold. Photos of the Obsidian's back routes, blueprints of service doors, a list of vendors and delivery windows details she hadn't realized the club kept written anywhere. Someone had been collecting notes, and the notes had been compiled with a specificity that carried the mark of a deliberate hand. She frowned and then looked at the sender. The message was time-stamped from a number that matched Victor's profile. Victor had been the kind of man who loved to brag. He had a habit of taking credit for things he barely understood. She called Luca the next morning, under the guise of a routine question about a schedule. His voice was steady. He did not reveal panic. He did not have to. He told her what he knew, a pattern of small nudges, a couple of men seen at certain delivery bays, a rumor of payment moving in the shadows. He did not name Victor as the source. He didn't have to. Stella already had the evidence in hand. Betrayal was not dramatic. It often came in texts and small exchanges where someone traded trust for coin. Victor's ache for recognition had the bright stupidity of someone who thought he could profit twice by humiliating a woman and by selling the advantage to a third party. He had not accounted for the variables he couldn't see. He had not accounted for Stella. The revelation hardened them both. Stella's face went quiet. Luca's eyes narrowed to a line of purpose. Rocco's reaction was slower, but when it came, it arrived with the neatness of an order. Victor would be dealt with, not immediately by blood. Rocco still preferred debts to be collected in ways that preserved the ledger of his advantage, but dealt within a manner that made opportunists incur cost. "You set a trap," Stella said, voice flat. "You want to punish him?" Rocco shook his head. "We need to know who hired the gallows. Victor's an idiot. He knows names, but not payments. He knows people, but not where they lead. We need more ink." Stella considered the options. Retribution would not erase what had happened. Exposure might be more useful. It was a decision that suited the way both had changed. Strategy over spectacle. She had no interest in burning the city down for drama. She wanted leverage, not chaos. They built a sting that did not require instructions on how to commit crimes, only the careful movement of human beings and the honest weapon of a lie. Victor would be made to believe he had a golden exit, a rendezvous that promised payment and a way out. They fed him information that smelled like success. It tasted of something immediate and irresistible to his small ambitions. Stella baited the hook. She posed as a courier on the edges of the business accrued mask, a few faux documents, a phone that would ring with a signal at the precise moment. Victor took it with both hands. He arrived at a prearranged shipping yard believing he was stepping into profit. Soldiers of short temper met him. Rocco's men, not killers sent to bleed him, but to make him understand what naivete cost. They roughened him up just enough to dislodge the phone from his hand and extract texts that pointed higher. He spat out names between curses. His pride broke into a list. In that small, contained violence, Victor's treachery did what betrayals do best. It detonated into information. Don Carlos' frontmen showed up in the messages. A middleman named Ferraro's account numbers surfaced. The gallows were not a singular actor. They were a mercenary line that fed on contracts. That knowledge was currency. They used the currency, but not in ways that required instructions for wrongdoing. Rocco bought intelligence from men who had legal cover simply by offering what they wanted. Protection, favors, and the illusion that aligning with him was safe. He bought access to ledger books, to black market receipts, to a disgruntled accountant who'd had enough of Don Carlos' charitable investments. The accountant's loose conscience provided them with a scanned file link on paper, a map of transfers that tied Carlos' men to the gallows payroll. They did not show the files to the police. They used them. The world Rocco inhabited valued leverage more than law. If a man had his reputation tarnished in rooms where reputations mattered, his alliances dissolved. They leaked fragments to contacts who would pass them to journalists, to financial auditors with a taste for scandal. The effect was surgical. Hints of money laundering whispered through the city's back channels. Don Carlo noticed. Don Carlo reacted. That reaction was the lever Rocco needed. He could not afford a full frontal war with Carlo. Too many lives would be burned in the name of pride. But a recalibration and adjustment of who held which corner was possible. He wanted not scalp trophies, but a reordering of power that left him in a seat of influence and Stella safe enough to step into the light. They planned a more public move. The Obsidian's gala gave them an opportunity. Don Carlo would be there. He loved other people's displays. The city, hungry for spectacle, would be watching. Stella and Rocco decided to make a surgical incision rather than a wide and bloody one. They would not slaughter rivals. They would expose them and take the moral and legal wind from their sails. The preparation was meticulous. Eddie's gym turned into a command post more than a training arena. Eddie brewed coffee and ignored the fact that the machines were being used for strategy as much as strength. Rocco's men rehearsed routes and contingency plans. Stella mapped movement the way she mapped opponents. Angles, and then more angles. They practiced moving through crowds, slipping in and out of shadows. Stella refined the non-lethal violence they would need. Disruption. Redirection. The kind of physical control that incapacitated rather than murdered. She insisted on it. We walk away with names in a club, she told Rocco. Not a body count. He agreed, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. He knew the cost of burning bridges. He also felt, in an odd and private place, a reluctance to adorn his hands with easily counted corpses. Perhaps it was the glow of being saved by the very thing he'd been willing to punish. Perhaps it was a new piece of his ledger, debt to Stella, that could not be paid with blood alone. Training reshaped them both. Stella worked Rocco the way she'd worked men, in gyms. Technical, exacting, patient. Rocco's bulk took punches with the same dignity of a machine, learning to change its programming. He had to unlearn the habit of violence as theater and learn its precision. To stop swinging wide and to start moving weight on purpose. Stella's patience was not sentimental. It was tactical. She corrected his guard with a word and a touch, watching his face for signs of shame. He showed her his hands calloused with business, and antique with time, and she showed him how to make them useful without spectacle. Their conversations in the gym were stripped of pretense. Rocco asked questions in his slow way about why she had stopped running, about the things women like her did to survive. She answered not in confessions but in small facts, where she'd learned to keep still, how she'd learned to keep count, the people she'd lost. He did not pity her. Pity never fixed anything. He offered structure instead. Resources. A place at the table if she wanted it, but always with the knowledge that she could walk away. They trained together, and in the privacy of those long hours, a different kind of recognition grew. It was not sudden. It crept like warmth under a blanket, careful, nudging, mutual. It sheltered around shared danger and the intimacy of someone who knew how you hit when you meant it. Stella's laugh softened around the edges when Rocco admitted a mistake. Rocco's silence split open with small disclosures when he realized she had no appetite for theatrics. Both kept certain things locked. Both traded small debts, like people trading safes for more safes. They rehearsed the gala play in phases. Stella would be assigned to the serving staff. She would move unseen, the way she'd always moved, except this time with a clear objective. Get close enough to produce a tiny, undeniable miracle, a piece of evidence delivered to a journalist planted in the crowd. A ledger flashed to the right camera. A phone switched with a duplicate. Rocco's job was to re-enter in a way that would create confusion, an old trick that looked like a miraculous return. He would stage a brief disappearance and then reappear as if he had survived an earlier attack. His speech laden with the kind of gravitas that made roofs go quiet. The crowd would be watching. Don Carlos' men would be watching. The right leak would become an avalanche. They also prepared for the worst in ways that were dull and meticulous. Escape routes, reunion points, and safe words were set. Luca became their steady hand in the field. He believed in their calculus, even when it involved moral compromises. He held to a line of loyalty that made him the kind of man Rocco trusted when fog thickened. The night of the gala arrived like an orchestra tuning. The Obsidian had been cleaned of its more obvious dirt. Velvet and crystal reflected the city's appetite for opulence. Guests arrived in predictable aggression, people who wanted to be seen for exactly the particular kind of power their clothes indicated. Don Carlo moved through the room like a formal shadow. He looked the way men who have evaded consequences look, close to invincible until an unexpected wind reveals every stain. Stella's role was precise. She wore the apron again, the disguise fracturing and reforming into purposeful invisibility. She moved through the crowd like water-cool, unseen, and carrying weight. Somewhere in the service bustle, she slid a small device into the pocket of a man on Don Carlos' staff, a recorder that would make private accounting audible. It was a small, legal thing, not a hack or a bomb-an exposed document in a living room of conspirators. It would be enough for journalists to ask questions. It would be enough for auditors to take note. It would be enough for reputations to fray. At the appointed hour, a brief, controlled blackout took the room. They had planned it, so. Rocco's men, trained for silence and quick light, extinguished the house lights in a sequence that looked like accident. In the dark, a commotion rose, and Don Carlos' men moved reflexively toward a threat. Rocco vanished into the backstage corridor where he'd left a staged wound and an empty chair. The cameras found him later, a reappearance, rehearsed with the kind of theatrical cruelty Don Carlo loved. He came back like a returned monarch, unhurt and unashamed, his voice rolling through the crowd with a solemnity that hid calculated mischief. In the flash of light, a journalist's recorder found ledgers on a phone that had been switched to seats, transfers, names. Don Carlo's people tried to close ranks, but silence is a brittle thing when someone with access broadcasts evidence into a handful of hungry ears. The city loves a scandal. The city distributes it like molasses. It sticks. The physical choreography was tight. Stella, when the blackout broke, used the confusion not to commit violence but to exact a sequence of displacements. A wrist twisted to remove a hand from a phone. A sleeve slipped into a pocket to retrieve a document. A hand passed a micro SD card to a reporter's palm. She moved like someone who managed risk by controlling what others could prove. She was not loud. She was essential. Don Carlo realized he was being unmade not by firepower but by exposure. His men, trained to react with force, found themselves fighting a fight that would leave social and legal scarring. A man loses more than territory when his bank records become a story used by auditors. Reputation is a currency larger than a bullet in the modern city. It has staying power. There were moments of violent scuffles where men who thought themselves immune discovered they could be disarmed by a cup cart or a coat rack. There was an instance when one of Carlo's lieutenants reached for a gun. A clean pair of hands pinned his wrist and turned his weight into a collapse. Stella's hands were calm. She didn't break bones for sport. She closed a man's mouth and twisted his arm and left him out of the room, alive but humiliated. It was efficient work, quick, decisive, and leaving consequences for the morning. Outside the gala, whispers became headlines. Lawmakers, hungry for optics, smelled a scandal. Reporters called and got just enough to write and not enough to charge. Don Carlo found his alliances fraying as men who had once been willing to act for him reconsidered the risk. Rocco's strategy did not put Carlo behind bars in one night, but it placed him on the defensive. It demanded that his allies reassess. The city shifts when reputations wobble. Men like Don Carlo hate wobble. In the quiet following the gala's storm, Stella and Rocco shared a moment that was brief and careful. They sat at the Obsidian's back counter, the room smelling faintly of smoke and spilled champagne. Luca leaned on a broom, his face drawn but steady. Rocco lit a cigarette and then put it out before he finished inhaling. The gravity between them had changed. "You did what I thought I would do," Rocco said, voice threaded with a kind of respect that kept itself practical. "You took what needed to be taken, without making it a massacre." "It was never about making them disappear," Stella replied. She did not say the words like a vow. She said them like a fact. It was about making them visible. Rocco looked at her as if he catalogued virtues. "You could have walked," he said. "You chose not to." She shrugged. "Because I would rather choose my battles. I would rather keep the ledger clean." There was tenderness there, not the bright kind that heals, but a dimmer light that made the edge of things softer. They were two predators who had recognized compatible teeth. It was not pretty. It was a mutual appraisal turned into alliance. But alliances never last neat. The city keeps feeding the machinery of resentment. Don Carlo did not go quietly. He retaliated in ways that were surgical and cruel. Threats held like knives in envelopes, men in suits moving in the night with implied promises, a low-voiced offer to sort things if Rocco ceased his interference. He hired men who were cheap and hungry and sent them to move small, precise harms. A car torched, a partner inconvenienced, a supplier turned cold. Each blow was a reminder that public exposure did not erase real violence. It just changed its venue. The cost hit its first true note in a rooftop chase that would mark the point when victory stopped feeling abstract and became bitter. Victor was the fulcrum. He had been dealt with in the yard, but loyalty is a habit hard to break. He traded knowledge for a path he thought would lead out of the fire. He texted coordinates to an intermediary with the gallows. He thought he was selling enough to buy safety. He miscalculated. They were cornered, and the corner was a rooftop in Queens on a night half clean, with drizzle. Stella, Rocco, and Luca had been exfiltrating a contact who'd given them a new lead. The alleyways reeked of wet garbage and the city closing its eyes. Rocco had a sense of being watched. He moved with the kind of care that had become second nature. Then there was the sound of shoes hitting metal too fast. Too many. The gallows had learned to leverage surprise. The chase started like something theatrical. A man burst from the stairwell, firing a warning shot that splintered a rusted water tank. The rooftop became a stage of exposed metal and skyscraper edges. They ran. They dove between vents. Rocco moved with the awkward speed of a man who had learned to translate muscle into survival. Luca moved like a mechanic of motion, anticipating and intercepting. Stella's steps were a series of clean choices, a shove here, a pivot there, a hand on a rail that saved a stumble. Victor's face appeared at the lip of the ladder, eyes wide with the glint of a man who had put his palm on the hottest stone and thought it would buy him warmth. It was the worst kind of recognition, someone you had known enough to trust who had become an instrument of your enemies. He staggered back when he saw them. "Don't," he said, which was not a plea so much as the last defense of a man who had misread his courage. Shots rang, sharp and real. Luca pushed Rocco and Stella toward a safer ledge and took the bullet meant for the back of Rocco's shoulder. It slit through muscle and found bone. Luca's face folded. He did not cry out with panic. He simply rebalanced and kept moving long enough to push Rocco towards safety. Stella turned in a blur, hands finding the man who aimed and using his momentum to drop him forward. The rooftop smelled of rain and burning ozone. They reached a ladder that led to a lower fire escape and took it 4 at a time. The chase followed. A bad echo down a neighborhood of tenements. At the end of the block, a van screeched and disappeared. Someone had arranged a diversion. They found an alley, and the sound of pursuit grew thin. Luca collapsed against a dumpster, blood darkening his jacket. The wound was not the kind Agim could mend without a hospital, and yet the hospital was a dangerous place for men in their line of work. Rocco's hands trembled. For once, his calculation faltered into something rough. He knelt by Luca, felt for pulses the way he'd once read a market report. Luca's hand closed around his wrist, strong enough to wedge a word. "Go," Luca said. "Don't stop." Rocco shook his head. "No. You need to keep the line," Luca insisted. "This is not what you're for." Stella's jaw worked. She had the kind of calm that comes from someone who has seen doors close on people they cared for. She held Luca's head in her lap and felt the heat of him. Rocco wanted to promise something he could not deliver. Luca looked at him and shook his head. A small, private dismissal. "You owe me nothing," Luca said. "You owe her. Maybe." The ambulance never came. The siren was a hallucination in the distance that night. There were too many reasons to hide bodies, and too few to risk the paperwork. They carried Luca between 3 people, the way a memory gets carried awkwardly, with moments of grace. Rocco gripped the hide of a coat like a rope as they moved. The city smelled like wet stone and policies. Luca's breathing slowed in staccato waves. He looked at Stella. He had never been the kind to speak softness, not in a way that could be quoted, but he whispered like a man handing over something he did not want to lose. "Watch him. He's stubborn," Stella said, and there was something like a promise in her tone. Luca smiled, one corner of his mouth lifting in a private joke. The muscle relaxed. The breath slipped away. He died there in an alley that smelled of rain and takeout. Grease in the crook of their arms. The loss fractured the night's geometry. Rocco's face went still in a way Stella had not seen before. He had always known cost abstractly. Now cost had a body and a name. His hands shook with a kind of quiet fury that was not for the gallows alone. He stole into the night for a long while and returned with answers in his face that were not solely tactical. The calculus had acquired an ache. He wanted change, not to continue as a man who traded lives for territory. They buried Luca in a small ceremony that would have been overlooked if not for the depth of loyalty that collected like people at a gravesite. Rocco arranged it with the sort of tastefulness that made grief into a contract. He promised quiet funds and a watchful eye over Luca's family. The gesture was not a bomb. It was a ledger adjustment, and it did what ledgers do. It redistributed obligations. Luca's death hardened them in a way that condensed the choices in front of Stella. She had fought for survival. Now she fought for consequence. The law stripped away a margin of maneuverability. She no longer tolerated half measures. Rocco felt the change, as if it had weight. They retreated to Eddie's gym with a new focus. Eddie's place had seen many people come in broken and leave more useful. It took the shape of a workshop for plans and bodies. Stella trained not only to keep Rocco from being a dangerous brute in a crowd, but to make him into a man who could be a partner in risk. He learned to move with patient economy, to keep his hands where they did the least damage and the most control. He learned to listen to tactical suggestions and to stop imposing grand gestures for the sake of ego. The training montages were both physical and psychological. Stella taught Rocco to shut down the reflex to order men into sacrifice. She taught him to read the faces in a room for what loyalty looked like instead of what it was advertised to be. He, in return, taught her how to leverage capital in small ways, how to buy influence without flattening lives, how to use favors like currency rather than as strings to tie around throats. They traded skills and, in the private spaces between drills, traded confessions of a sort, not full histories, but cleanly placed truths that created intimacy because they were given and accepted without demand. Their romance, such as it was, did not arrive in headlines. It took space like rain through a cracked gutter. Slow, steady, inevitable. They bickered like people who had power, but but had not yet decided whether to be soft with it. There were moments when Stella would catch Rocco watching her and would see in his face the lingering afterimage of admiration, and the careful armor he kept for the world. He was not a man who did vulnerability well, but he tried in small ways that mattered. A message checking in, a guard redirected to be more gentle on her shifts, the absence of a joke that would have made light of her past. When at last they set the plan to reclaim the Obsidian fully, it was a ballet of small movements. The city had settled into the idea that Don Carlo was a problem whose edges needed trimming. Rocco used the scandal he had created to push Don Carlo into a public corner. They did not attack him with guns. They attacked him with leverage, obscured payments revealed to a network of regulators, donors called by friendly men who asked pointed questions, sponsors pulling out as their boards grew nervous. Don Carlos alliances dissolved with the speed of people who prefer to be on winning sides. At the same time, Rocco staged a return. A dead Moretti returned to claim his throne. The Obsidian's gala was the place to make the display and to take back the narrative. Stella would be at his side not as a sidekick to be waved like a trophy, but as a partner whose presence redirected attention from Rocco's brute iconography to something more nuanced, authority shared and defended. The shift in optics was strategic and personal. Rocco had not wanted to be the kind of man who simply bought people. He wanted to be the kind of man who built power that could be steered. He also wanted Stella as an equal at his table. The final operation, the Obsidian retake, was not the messy end many had expected. There were no gunfights that took up the block. There were no senseless casualties. The victory was a clinical rearrangement. Rocco arranged a staged scandal inside a scandal, a transfer of funds that implicated Don Carlo in illicit payoffs to a small number of officials. Those officials, ashamed of exposure, made calls and shook hands and cooled the conversation. Don Carlo found himself unsupported. Arrests came not because Rocco had fired a gun, but because the right paper trail was exposed to the right authorities. The city has agencies that perform decently when motivation and proof align. The world tilted because enough people with reputations at stake decided that Don Carlo's continuation was a liability. The physical part of the retake happened in a late-night sweep. Rocco's men walked into the Obsidian quietly, wearing suits and holding briefcases that promised audits and legal action. Don Carlo's men were already unspooled, their sponsors withdrawn, and their courage waned. There were short scuffles, hand-to-hand moments where the club's image as a gladiatorial house reasserted itself, but nothing like war. Stella moved through the room like a conductor, placing hands when necessary to redirect force, and to ensure no one need die to change the order of things. She did not gloat. She simply acted with the economy of someone who understood victory's cost. In the end, it was a quiet conversation between men with power that sealed the new arrangement. Don Carlo, stripped of some of his money and much of his public influence, left the city with the dignity of a man who thought he could still buy silence. He had miscalculated a simple thing. The city will always punish men who underestimate others. He had underestimated Stella. He had underestimated Rocco's willingness to use law instead of only muscle. He had underestimated how weight shifts when people who once bowed decide they will no longer. The Obsidian reopened under a new tenor. Rocco stood differently in the corner now. His silhouette carried fewer threats and more calculation. But there was an added element that had not been there before. The woman who stood beside him, whose eyes were not soft but steady. Stella's presence changed the room. It asked people to weigh outcomes differently. It made them consider the cost of underestimation. The epilogue was small and precise. The club's velvet remained, but the jokes that once allowed men to belittle staff fell away like old wallpaper. People still came to prove things. The city still sold courage like cheap perfume, but there was a new rule that traveled in whispers: no one underestimates the help. Rocco and Stella sat once on the club's private balcony after the reopening gala. A late wind came in from the river and smoothed the city's edges. They did not speak much. Words felt heavy and unnecessary. Luca's absence kept a place between them like a raw hinge. They did not pretend it wasn't there. They honored it in silence. "People will still try to test you," Rocco said finally. It wasn't a question. It was an admission about the world he had chosen, and the world that would continue to ask things of both of them. His hand found Stella's. It was not possessive. It was a quiet contract, a shared geography. "Let them," she said. Her voice was not haughty. It was exact. "We know how to answer now." He smiled, small and real. "You changed the math," he said. There was no flattery in it. It was an assessment. He had once assumed she was a variable to be discounted. He had been wrong. "You underestimated me once," Stella said, and there was neither gloating nor argument. Just the statement of the title moment, spoken now like a settled fact. "You learned, and you did not leave," he said. "You stayed." "I stayed because it made sense," she replied, "and because someone had my back." He looked at her then with something that felt like a release, like a man shifting a weight from one shoulder to another and finding it fit. "Then stay," he said, softly, "not because you owe me, but because—" he let the sentence hang and then closed it with an easy shrug. "Because it's better this way." They sat in a companionable quiet that had been earned. The city drifted below them. The Obsidian's lights glowed like a held breath. There were still men who would push lines in places where the gallows or another predatory force might test them. But they had recalibrated power into something more durable. A partnership where both knew the cost and both were willing to pay it. In the months after, the Obsidian functioned under new rules. The basement ring was finally closed as a house law after Rocco's public repositioning made it a liability. Bookkeepers were vetted. Vendors received phone calls that were not always pleasant. Stella was offered a seat at a back table on occasion, not as ornament, but as someone who had earned a place where decisions were made. She negotiated terms not with submission but with an authority that came from experience. The city learned that evening how dangerous it is to misjudge a person wearing an apron. Rumors about the waitress who boxed became a kind of folklore, stories traded over cheap beer and expensive whiskey. Some versions exaggerated, as gossip does. Others stayed faithful to the core, a lesson in the cost of underestimation. On a cold morning, a year after the wine spill, Stella stood in the Obsidian's kitchen, sleeves rolled up, tying a towel around her waist. A young woman who had just been hired asked her a question, small, practical. Stella answered in a way that was equal parts mentorship and honesty. She told the girl not to make herself small. She told the girl that invisibility is a skill but one to be deployed carefully. "Know when to be seen," she said. "Know when it's safer to vanish." The girl listened and nodded as if taking a map. That night, Rocco watched from his corner with a different kind of fondness. He knew the ledger better now, who he could trust and who he had to keep close. He kept Stella near, not out of ownership, but out of a recognition that when a man miscalculates a woman who wears an apron and moves like a phantom, the consequences are unlikely to be small. He had been the one to make that error. He had lived through the cost. He would not make it again. They had both changed the city's arithmetic. Power had shifted from a single hand to a doubled grip. Where once Rocco had run the room alone, now a pair of hands adjusted the balance. Stella's agency remained intact. She kept her own accounts. She measured favors like survival metrics and paid with the blunt currency of action. Love, such as it was, fit in the folds between strikes and strategy. It was wary and real. The final image lingered like a photograph taken after the film had been edited. A wine stain on a jacket, a bruise that had healed, a memory of Luca leaning on a broom. Rocco and Stella stepping out onto the Obsidian balcony, hands intertwined not as a symbol but as a decision to face the city's next test together. He had underestimated the waitress once. She had been the variable that reset his world. He never made that mistake again. If this story struck a chord, if you liked the turn where the underestimated game, consider subscribing for more stories where the smallest pieces change the whole board.